Good morning, y'all. It's good to see everybody again today via this medium as we begin to look at, or as we continue to look at our discussion of the book of Genesis. Today we come to a couple of interesting chapters here in chapters 23 and 24. And as we think about this text, I think it's incredibly important for us as we are nearing kind of the end of the story of Abraham. You know, one of the things we mentioned as we ended our time last week was that chapter 22 ended by pointing us forward to the next stage in the story. And as we think about that and moving forward in the story, we come to these chapters here and the stories we find in chapters 23 and 24. And in many ways, they show us a different side of Abraham. Chapter 22, as we saw last week, was kind of the culmination of his faith journey and his faith odyssey, as we talked about. But chapter 23 and chapter 24 really begin to show Abraham's concern for what happens to his promises, to these promises that God has made. They raise questions about whether God will indeed be faithful to the next generation or not. Will God bless Abraham's descendants the way that God had blessed him? Will God lead Isaac the same way? Will his children be faithful to the covenant in the way that Abraham had? For those of you who are parents out there, these questions are things that perhaps you too have thought about in your life. As you've looked at your own children and wondered these kinds of things about them. Maybe some of you parents out there have seen the answers to these questions in such a way that for some of you may fill you with great hope and warm your heart seeing that your children have indeed become faithful. Maybe for others of you, you've experienced the heartache of trying to raise faithful children only to see them not remain faithful. But I think for all of us who have kids, these questions and these experiences that we're going to see play out today in the text of Genesis 23 and 24 are instructive for us. They're things we can relate to. And so with that in mind, we come to chapter 23. Chapter 23 opens with the death of Sarah. It tells us here in verse 1 that Sarah lived 127 years, and these were the years of the life of Sarah. Sarah is interestingly the only woman in the Old Testament whose life is given, who the years of her life are given this way. That should tell us something significant about Sarah and the role that she played. I mean, we see these kinds of statements throughout the book of Genesis about different men, Abraham and Adam, and we go back and to look at like chapter 5 there, and you read through all these generations and things, and it is year after verse of so and so lived this many years. But Sarah's the only woman we see that for. But Sarah died, and Abraham went in to mourn for her. But verse 3 tells us that he rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of sight. This is an interesting request that shows us indeed the great faith of Abraham. One of the things that would have been customary in the ancient Near Eastern world is that when you died, you would have been buried in your homeland. You would have been buried in the land that you had come from. And when Sarah dies, Abraham doesn't do that. He doesn't go back to Ur of the Chaldees, where his family still is, and bury her there. Abraham says, I am sojourning in this land, but I want to buy a place to bury my wife. In making this request of the Hittites, Abraham says, this is my family's land. I am confident in the promise of God that He is going to give us this land, and I know it may not be for several hundred years still, but God has promised that He's giving this land to my descendants. And I am going to put my faith in God and make this my family's land. This is where I am claiming my possession, because I am confident in God Abraham's desire to bury Sarah in this land is more than just burying her there because it's where they are. It is a confident statement, an expression of faith in the God of the covenant. He says, "This is my family's land and inheritance. This is where we will reside. This is where my descendants are going to live. And we will be buried here." Well, as this encounter between Abraham and the Hittites plays out, they say, "Hear us, my Lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs." This isn't burying them in a ground. This isn't Abraham buying a plot of ground to dig a hole and place a body down into. No, tombs during this period in the ancient Near Eastern world would have been caves. Abraham says, "I want to buy a cave, a tomb, and from you." And the Hittites said, "We're not going to withhold anything from you." And so Abraham says, "All right, then this is the tomb I want. I want to buy this tomb from Ephron, the son of Zohar, that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he owns. And it's at the end of his field." And Abraham says there in verse 9, "For the full price let him give it to me in your presence as property for a burying place." It seems possible here that the Hittites were concerned about Abraham owning land. It would have been very unusual for someone sojourning to actually own property, and for the people who lived in that land to sell that property to a foreigner. Perhaps there was some type of deception that the Hittites intended to bring about here. And as you read through verses 10 through 13, you get some of that, where Ephron says, "No, I give you the field and I give you the cave. Go bury your dead." And Abraham says, You don't seem to be understanding. I don't just want your permission to use the cave. I want to buy the cave. I want to own it. I want it to be my property. And so eventually, Ephron says there in verse 14, "Okay, my Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." 400 shekels of silver would have been an insane amount of money. In the ancient Near Eastern world, the average salary annually for a laborer was about 10 shekels of silver. This is a lifetime savings kind of amount of money. Now, we know Abraham was a wealthy man. He had the money to buy it. He had the means to do it. But it seems like Ephron here is throwing out this insane number, assuming that Abraham would never say yes to it. And much to his surprise, Abraham says, "It's done." Abraham listened, and he weighed out for Ephron the silver that he had named him in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 shekels of silver. Abraham said, "I don't care what the cost is. I'm willing to pay it because this is what it looks like for me to put my faith and my confidence in God." What again an example of faith on the part of Abraham. From there, the rest of the chapter kind of reads like a fairly common legal deed. The end of verse 16 says that Abraham measured out this money according to the weights current among the merchants. This phrase is a specific phrase common in ancient Near Eastern legal contracts and real estate transactions. The very wording here seems that this is indicating this is the legal binding agreement. Abraham bought this property, and he bought it so that it would be his, confident that one day this land in Canaan would indeed belong to his descendants. And so, chapter 23 ends with the cave and the field that it was in being made over to Abraham as a property for a burying place by the Hittites. And so now Abraham has buried his wife. And as chapter 24 opens, Abraham, you have to think, is beginning to wonder how much longer he has. If Sarah was 127, that means Abraham was at least 137. He was 10 years older than her. And so by the time chapter 24 opens, Abraham is about 140 years old. I mean, if you're 140, you have to begin wondering how much longer God is going to give you. You have to think, surely your time is coming to an end. And as Abraham begins to confront the realities of his own mortality, he turns his attention to his son. He wants to make sure that he has done everything he can to provide for Isaac, to help Isaac be faithful to God. And so, chapter 24 begins with Abraham calling his servant, the oldest of his household, who he had put in charge of all that he had, and asking him to make an oath and help him find a wife for his son Isaac. We believe that servant to be Eleazar, the same servant mentioned in chapter 15 when Abraham was wondering if this would have to be his heir. We don't know that for certain, but it certainly seems that that is indeed who was being talked about here. So Abraham calls this servant in, calls Eleazar in, and he says, I want you to swear to me that you will go and find a wife for my son. But here in verse 3 he says, but that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. This isn't some xenophobic racism on the part of Abraham here. It's not that he's concerned about what it looks like for Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman because she's a Canaanite. But this is about faithfulness. Abraham says, I want you to go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. I do not want him marrying one of these unfaithful and immoral women in this land who do not know you. He says, I want him to marry a faithful wife. Again, for those of us with children, this is the kind of thing that we think about, isn't it? Wanting our kids to marry faithful Christian spouses. Not necessarily because it's sinful to marry a non-Christian, but because what we know is that when both people in the marriage, when husband and wife are both pushing toward the same goal of a lifetime of faithfulness and living as citizens of the kingdom of God, it makes it a lot easier to live out that kind of life. Frequently in the New Testament we read instructions about this, cautions against being unequally yoked. I think many of us can relate here to Abraham, wanting to make sure that his son marries a woman who will help him be faithful to God. Well, from there, the servant asked, well, Master, what if the woman doesn't want to come with me? Must I take Isaac back to that land? He says, you're not taking Isaac back there. We're leaving Isaac here because I do not want him going back and making his home in the land where we came from. This is the land God has given us, and Isaac is not to leave it at any cost. But Abraham says here in verse 7, God, will send His angel before you, and you shall take a wife from my son from there. Abraham says, I've tried to meddle and take things into my own hands so many times in my life, but I've learned my lessons. I've learned what it looks like. I know what it means to be faithful. I'm not going to make that mistake again. I am confident that God will indeed bless this process. Abraham trusts fully in the providential care and provision of God. In chapter 22, the overarching message was that God will provide. And here Abraham shows that faith again, confident that God will indeed provide a wife for his son. Well, from there, in verse 10 of chapter 24, we see that the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all sorts of choice gifts from the master. And he arose and went to Mesopotamia, to the city of Nahor. This is a telling verse in and of itself. Camels were not incredibly common in the days of Abraham. Historical records show us that they did exist in Babylon by this point, but that they were the purview of the wealthiest. Most people did not have camels, let alone 10 of them. Eleazar took 10 of the camels. And that's not to say that those were all of Abraham's camels. We know he had at least 10. Maybe he had more. Abraham was indeed a very wealthy and prosperous man. That's not counting all the gold jewelry that the servant takes with him. But he loads all these things up and he goes. And when he gets there, he gets to the well out at the edge of the city. And he has his camels to kneel down to drink. Because he knew that the time of day was when women go out to draw water. And this servant again shows his faith and confidence in God to provide. And he begins to pray here in verse 12. And he prays, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. This idea of showing steadfast love is the same text, and the same word, rather, and phrase used elsewhere in the Old Testament to talk about God's provision and love for His covenant people. What the servant is praying here is for God to be faithful to the covenant, to the people of His covenant. He says, show your covenant love, the love you show to those who are part of your covenant people. Show that love to my master Abraham today by giving me success in this task he has sent me on. And he says, behold, I'm standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Please let one of them give me a drink, and let my camels drink. And by this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. But before he even finished speaking, I love this phrase here in verse 15, before he even finished speaking, God acts. And behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with a jar on her shoulder. It tells us in verse 16 that this young woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden whom no man had known. And she went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. And after she fills her jar, the servant says, this is the woman God has sent. And he goes and he asks, will you give me a drink? And she says, yes, sir, drink. That was the first part of the test, that the servant was planning to find the woman God was leading them to. And then when she had finished giving him a drink, verse 19 tells us that he asked her, or that she voluntarily said, and I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking. This was a major commitment. A camel during these days, after the length of journey that it had, could drink up to about 25 gallons of water. And there were 10 of these camels. That's 250 gallons of water. And based upon the average size historically of what we know vessels and jars would have been at this point, what we're talking about is Rebekah filling her jar somewhere between 80 and 100 times. This would have taken over 2 hours for all these camels to drink to their fullness. But that's the kind of hospitality that Rebekah shows to the servant of Abraham. And when all of this was done, it had confirmed what the servant had set out to find. And so verse 22 tells us that he took a gold ring weighing a half shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels and said, tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? And she said, I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. And the man realized that this girl was part of Abraham's family. And what does he do? Verse 24, the man bowed his head, verse 26 rather, the man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord and said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master." He praised God for his faithfulness and his steadfast love. Well, from there, Rebekah runs on home to her family to tell them of the things that have happened. And when her brother Laban sees these things that have happened, he runs out to her. And then he runs out to greet this visitor. And he says, "Come inside, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside? I have prepared the house for you and a place for the camels." And they bring this servant in. They realized clearly that this was a very wealthy man who was coming, who wanted their daughter, who wanted his sister to marry their heir. And they said, "Please eat." And the man says, "No, I can't eat yet. I need to tell you about everything I've done. And I need to tell you about the faithfulness of God and how He's led me here." And so in verses 34 through 49, we find this retelling of the story as the servant of Abraham recounts everything that has happened. This is an intentional literary device here. This was designed to tell the story again, to emphasize again how faithful God had been, and to really set the stage so that by the time you get to the retelling of it, and he says, "Well, I want your sister and your daughter to marry my master's son Isaac," you're building up to the question, what are they going to say? What's the answer going to be? Is she going to go? Are they going to let her? And verse 50, then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, "This thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken." They understood that God had ordained this process, and they said, "Let her go." And so when Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the earth before the Lord. And he brought out jewelry of gold and silver and garments, and he gave them to Rebekah. And he gave them to her brother and to her mother, costly ornaments. And he and the men who were with them ate and drank, and they spent the night there. And the next morning arose, he said, "Send me away to my master." And her brother and her mother said, "Well, let Rebekah stay just a little bit longer." And he says, "Do not delay me. The Lord has blessed me. Send me away that I may go to my master." And they said, "Well, let's ask Rebekah if she wants to stay a little bit longer." And Rebekah comes and says, "No, I am going to go." And they sent her away with her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, "O sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate them." This was indeed what was going to happen. Through the children of Isaac and Rebekah, God was going to continue to bless the family of Abraham. And so Rebekah shows her faith in God by going with this servant. And so they went their way. And as the chapter ends, it tells us that Isaac was out in the field meditating. This word meditating is interesting, and it's hard for us to know exactly what it means, but it seems to mean that Isaac had gotten in this habit of going out into the field alone to mourn or lament the death of his mother. And as he's out there mourning the loss of his mother, he lifts up his eyes and he saw the caravan coming back. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she got off of the camel and said, "Who is this man walking in the field to meet us?" And the servant said, "It is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. Seemingly, this was a decision designed to indicate by putting the veil on that she was the one whom he was to marry. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. And Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. And so Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Mourning and sorrow were turned into joy. Joy through knowing that God was going to continue the promise to bless Abraham and his generations. And with that, chapter 24 comes to a close. But as we think about this, I think it's important for us to understand and remember and to see through all of this the significance of faithfulness through the everyday things we do. Whether that be how we raise our children and the concern we have for our children, certainly that's something we should be faithful in. Something that we as parents should be concerned about. Wanting to make sure that we are raising the kinds of kids who will grow up to be faithful. That we are doing everything we can to make sure that when we are gone, our children know God. The God of our covenant. The new covenant in Jesus Christ. But I think it also reminds us of the importance of being faithful in small everyday things. Rebekah showed her faithfulness in the hospitality she showed to a man and his camels. Abraham showed his faithfulness in where he chose to bury his wife. The servant showed his faithfulness in obeying his master. All of these things seem like simple, everyday kind of decisions and actions. And so I think what that should remind all of us of is that our everyday actions are great indications of our faithfulness. It means that how we treat other people is a sign of our faithfulness. It means the tone we take is a sign of our faithfulness. It means that the way we interact with people is a sign of our faithfulness. It means that the mundane decisions we make reflect more than just those decisions. They reflect how we view life and how we view our relationship with God and our faithfulness to Him in the small things. Jesus reminds us in the parable that those who are faithful with little will be given much. We have a lot of little everyday decisions. And how faithful we are in making those decisions has a great bearing on our overall faithfulness in this life. Genesis chapters 23 and 24 seem like pretty ordinary kind of things. The death of a loved one, the marriage of another. They're part of the human existence. But they remind us a great deal of the importance of being faithful every day. In the little things and the big things. In the ordinary and in the extraordinary. May we be people like Abraham, like Isaac, like Rebekah, like Eleazar, who are faithful in all that God gives us and praise Him as a God who provides.